something extraordinary unfold right now. America's unchallenged dominance is being tested in ways we haven't seen in decades. Mexico just made a stunning pivot toward the BRICS alliance, and it's not because they suddenly stopped liking us. It's because our foreign policy has become so rigid, so focused on military solutions and economic coercion, that our own neighbors are looking elsewhere for partnership. Russia, despite every sanction we've thrown at them, isn't collapsing. They're adapting, building new trade corridors, strengthening ties with the global south, and demonstrating that the old playbook of isolation doesn't work anymore. This isn't about choosing sides or celebrating anyone's success. It's about recognizing a fundamental shift in how power operates globally. We spent 30 years after the Cold War believing we could dictate terms to the entire world, that our economic model was the only path forward, that our military reach gave us permanent advantage. But coercion breeds resentment, and resentment breeds alternatives. What we're witnessing isn't the decline of American potential, it's the consequences of American overreach, and understanding this distinction is absolutely critical for our future. Let me tell you something that nobody in Washington wants to admit. We're living through one of the most significant geopolitical realignments in modern history, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. The comfortable narrative we've been fed for 3 decades, that America won the Cold War and therefore gets to write the rules for everyone else indefinitely, is crumbling before our eyes. And the two countries forcing us to confront this reality couldn't be more different or more instructive. Mexico, our neighbor, our third largest trading partner, a country we've taken for granted for generations, is now seriously considering joining BRICS. And Russia, the country we've spent the last 2 years trying to economically destroy, is not only surviving but actually expanding its influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These aren't random events, they're symptoms of a much deeper problem with how we've chosen to exercise power in the post-Cold War era. Let's start with Mexico, because this one should really wake us up. Mexico's potential move toward BRICS isn't happening because they've suddenly become anti-American or because they've fallen in love with Beijing or Moscow. It's happening because we've given them very few other options. Think about this carefully. For decades, we've treated Mexico as essentially an economic appendage of the United States. We wanted their labor when it was cheap, we wanted their markets when it suited us, and we wanted them to be the front line in our war on drugs. A war, by the way, that's been an unmitigated disaster for Mexican society. We've spent years lecturing them about corruption while American guns flooded south across the border, arming cartels and destabilizing entire regions. We've threatened them with tariffs, built walls, implemented immigration policies that separated families, and generally treated them as a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. And here's what's truly remarkable about the Mexican situation. They're not doing this out of spite. They're doing it out of necessity and self-interest, which is exactly what any sovereign nation should do. BRICS offers Mexico something that we've been increasingly unwilling to provide: partnership without condescension, economic cooperation without political strings attached, and access to markets and financing that don't come with a lecture about how they should run their country. When China invests in infrastructure in Mexico, they don't attach conditions about judicial reform or human rights. When Russia talks about energy cooperation, they don't threaten sanctions if Mexico doesn't vote the right way at the United Nations. Now, I'm not saying the Chinese or Russian approach is morally superior. That's not the point. The point is that our approach has become so heavy-handed, so obviously self-serving, that we're pushing away countries that should be natural allies. The BRICS expansion is itself a fascinating development that Americans need to understand better. BRICS started as an acronym, a clever bit of investment bank marketing. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It was supposed to represent emerging markets with growth potential, but it's evolved into something far more significant. It's becoming an alternative pole of power in a world that's increasingly multipolar, whether we like it or not. And the expansion isn't random. Countries are lining up to join because BRICS represents an alternative to a system where the United States and its European allies make the rules, control the financial infrastructure, and can essentially weaponize the dollar and the banking system against anyone who steps out of line. This brings us to Russia, and here's where the cognitive dissonance in Washington becomes almost painful to watch. We were told that sanctions would collapse the Russian economy. We were told that cutting Russia off from SWIFT would be devastating. We were told that Western companies leaving would cripple their industrial base. We were told that the ruble would become rubble, that Putin's government would fall, that the Russian people would rise up in revolution. None of it happened. Now, before anyone accuses me of being pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine, let me be absolutely clear. I'm pro-reality. And the reality is that our strategy hasn't worked the way we thought it would, and continuing to pretend otherwise is dangerous. Russia has adapted in ways that should concern us, not because we should sympathize with Russia, but because it demonstrates the limits of American economic power in the 21st century. They've redirected their energy exports to Asia. They've built new payment systems that bypass Western financial infrastructure. They've deepened their partnership with China to a degree that would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. They've expanded their influence in Africa, often filling vacuums that we created when we pulled back, or when our partnerships proved too exploitative to sustain. They've positioned themselves as a counterweight to Western power in the Middle East, and countries in that region are increasingly hedging their bets, maintaining relationships with both Moscow and Washington because they've learned that putting all your eggs in one basket is strategically foolish. And here's something that really should make us think. Russia is doing all of this while under the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. That's not a sign of Russian strength necessarily, but it's definitely a sign of the weakening effectiveness of our primary tool of coercion. We've used sanctions so frequently against so many countries that the rest of the world has spent the last 2 decades building workarounds. They've created alternative payment systems, alternative financing mechanisms, alternative trade routes. They've diversified their reserves away from dollars. They've built partnerships with each other that specifically exclude us. We did this to ourselves through overuse of financial weapons that only work if everyone agrees that the American-led financial system is the only game in town. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency has been one of our greatest strategic advantages. It's allowed us to run massive deficits without the consequences that would cripple other nations. It's allowed us to impose our will through financial pressure rather than military force. But that advantage is eroding not because the dollar is weak in traditional economic terms, but because more and more countries are actively trying to reduce their dependence on it. When Saudi Arabia starts accepting yuan for oil sales, that's not just a transaction, it's a geopolitical statement. When countries discuss creating a BRICS currency or expanding the use of local currency swaps, they're building the infrastructure for a world where American financial hegemony is just one option among several, not the only option. Let me take you back to the fundamental mistake we made after the Cold War ended. We treated the Soviet collapse not as a tragedy to be managed carefully, not as an opportunity to build a genuinely inclusive international system, but as a victory that entitled us to dictate terms. We expanded NATO eastward despite promises, despite Russian objections, despite warnings from our own diplomats and Russia experts that this would create exactly the security tensions we're now living with. We supported color revolutions in former Soviet states without considering how Russia might perceive having Western-aligned governments installed on their borders. We intervened in Libya, turning it from a stable, if authoritarian state into a failed state with open-air slave markets. We destroyed Iraq, killing hundreds of thousands, spending trillions of dollars, and creating a power vacuum that gave birth to ISIS. We've been involved in Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and dozens of other conflicts, often making situations worse rather than better. And through all of this, we've maintained a narrative of American exceptionalism that makes it almost impossible to have honest conversations about our foreign policy failures. Any criticism is dismissed as anti-American or naive. Any suggestion that we should negotiate rather than dictate is treated as weakness. Any acknowledgement that other countries might have legitimate security interests that conflict with ours is seen as capitulation. This isn't just unhelpful, it's dangerous. It creates a foreign policy establishment that can't learn from mistakes because it can't acknowledge mistakes in the first place. The situation with Mexico and Russia illustrates a broader pattern. Countries around the world are diversifying their partnerships, and they're doing it because depending too heavily on the United States has become a strategic liability. When we disagree with their domestic policies, we threaten sanctions. When they vote against us at the United Nations, we threaten to cut aid. When they pursue economic relationships we don't like, we threaten their access to our markets. This isn't leadership, it's coercion. And coercion only works as long as you're strong enough that countries have no alternative but to submit. But we're not that strong anymore, and the world is full of alternatives now. China's Belt and Road Initiative, whatever its flaws and whatever ulterior motives Beijing might have, is fundamentally attractive to developing countries because it offers something tangible: roads, ports, power plants, connectivity. When we criticize China's debt trap diplomacy, and some of those criticisms are valid, we often fail to ask why countries are accepting Chinese loans in the first place. It's usually because Western institutions like the World Bank and IMF come with conditions that are politically toxic. Privatize this, liberalize that, cut these subsidies, raise those prices. China says, we'll build you a port, here's the loan, pay us back over 30 years. It's a straightforward transaction. Countries know what they're getting into, and many of them decide it's worth it. The same dynamic applies to Russia's role in global energy markets. Europe's attempts to rapidly cut itself off from Russian energy have been economically painful and politically destabilizing. Meanwhile, Russia has simply redirected those exports to Asia at slightly reduced prices. India has increased its Russian oil imports dramatically. China has locked in long-term gas contracts at favorable rates. From Russia's perspective, they've maintained their export revenues while the Europeans have paid dramatically higher prices for energy from elsewhere. Who won that exchange? It's certainly not as clear-cut as we were told it would be. The Global South is watching all of this very carefully. African nations, Latin American nations, Asian nations that aren't aligned with either the West or the Russia-China axis. They're watching how we wield power, and they're watching how countries that defy us are actually surviving and sometimes thriving. They're watching how we lecture everyone about the rules-based international order while we ignore international law when it suits us. They watched us invade Iraq without UN authorization. They watched us intervene in Libya. They're watching our approach to Israel and Palestine, where we provide diplomatic cover and military support for actions that much of the world sees as violations of international humanitarian law. They see the double standards, and they're drawing conclusions about whether aligning with us serves their interests. This isn't about morality Olympics, about whether America is good or bad compared to China or Russia. In many ways, American power has been more benign than previous hegemons. We've promoted democracy and human rights, even if inconsistently. We've built international institutions that have provided stability. We've created a global economy that has lifted billions out of poverty. But we've also overthrown governments, supported dictators when convenient, turned blind eyes to atrocities committed by allies, and prioritized our narrow interests over global well-being repeatedly. And the rest of the world isn't blind to this. They're making rational calculations about their interests, just like we make rational calculations about ours. Mexico's potential BRICS membership should be a wake-up call about our relationship with Latin America more broadly. For 2 centuries, we've treated Latin America as our backyard, intervening whenever we felt our interests were threatened. We've overthrown democratically elected governments. We've supported military coups. We've implemented economic policies through international institutions that enriched our corporations while impoverishing their populations. And now we're surprised when they look for alternatives. The Monroe Doctrine mentality that Latin America is ours to control is not only morally bankrupt, it's strategically obsolete. These are sovereign nations with their own interests, and those interests don't always align with ours. The competition with China in Latin America is a perfect example of our failures. China has become the largest trading partner for most South American countries. They've invested billions in infrastructure. They've provided financing without the political conditions we typically attach. And what's our response? We tell Latin American countries not to work with China because China is bad, but we don't offer compelling alternatives. We don't match Chinese investment. We don't provide better financing terms. We just expect countries to align with us out of historical loyalty or fear, and that's not a sustainable strategy. Russia's ability to maintain and even expand influence despite unprecedented sanctions demonstrates another crucial point. Military power and economic power are increasingly separate things, and neither is sufficient to ensure global influence anymore. We have the strongest military in the world by far, but that hasn't translated into getting what we want in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, or Libya. We have the largest economy in the world, but that hasn't prevented countries from defying us when they calculate that the benefits of defiance outweigh the costs. Power is diffusing, and it's diffusing in ways that make the world more complex and less amenable to simple solutions. The Ukraine conflict has crystallized these dynamics in remarkable ways. We see it as defending democracy against authoritarianism, as supporting a sovereign nation against unprovoked aggression. Much of the rest of the world sees it as a proxy war between great powers, with Ukraine as the unfortunate battlefield. They see our stated principles about sovereignty and territorial integrity and wonder why those principles didn't apply in Iraq or Kosovo, or when we recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital despite international consensus. I'm not saying the Russian invasion was justified. It wasn't. I'm saying that our moral authority to lead the global response has been compromised by our own actions, and we need to reckon with that rather than dismissing everyone who doesn't fully support our position as Russian dupes or appeasers. The nuclear dimension of the Russia situation is something we're not talking about seriously enough. We're in the most dangerous nuclear moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, possibly more dangerous, and there's almost no public discussion about it. We're providing weapons that are being used to strike inside Russia. We're training Ukrainian forces. We're providing intelligence that enables Ukrainian military operations. From Russia's perspective, NATO is at war with them, even if we're fighting through a proxy. And they're a nuclear power that has updated their nuclear doctrine in response to these perceived threats. The casual way we've sleepwalked into this situation should terrify anyone who remembers the Cold War. This brings me to a crucial point about American foreign policy discourse. We've lost the ability to think in terms of interests rather than values. Every foreign policy question becomes a moral crusade. You're either with us or against us. You either support freedom or you support tyranny. This binary thinking makes negotiation nearly impossible. How do you negotiate with evil? How do you compromise with tyranny? But international relations has never been about simple moral choices. It's about managing competing interests, finding ways for countries with different systems to coexist without killing each other, and building frameworks that make cooperation more attractive than conflict. That requires acknowledging that other countries have legitimate interests, even when those interests conflict with ours. The China situation exemplifies this problem. We've decided that China is our primary strategic competitor, maybe even our enemy. Fine, that's a policy choice. But then what? Are we trying to contain China? Are we trying to change China? Are we trying to coexist with China? Because those require very different strategies, and we seem to be pursuing all three simultaneously while hoping it somehow works out. We want to decouple economically, but not too much because our economies are deeply integrated. We want to contain them militarily, but we need their cooperation on climate change. We want to compete for influence in the developing world, but we don't want to actually invest the resources necessary to compete effectively. It's incoherent, and countries around the world can see that it's incoherent. Mexico, looking toward BRICS, and Russia expanding its global partnerships, despite our opposition, are both symptoms of this incoherence. They're symptoms of a foreign policy that's simultaneously overextended and ineffective, that tries to do everything everywhere, but often accomplishes little of lasting value. We maintain nearly 800 military bases around the world, spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, and yet we're steadily losing influence. That should prompt serious questions about whether we're using our resources wisely, whether our strategy is working, whether the assumptions underlying our approach are still valid. The honest answer is that many of our assumptions aren't valid anymore. We assumed that economic globalization would inevitably lead to political liberalization. It hasn't. We assumed that spreading democracy would make the world more peaceful. The results are mixed at best. We assumed that American leadership was so beneficial that countries would naturally want to follow us. They increasingly don't. We assumed that military dominance would translate into political influence. It often doesn't. We assumed that our development model was universally applicable. It isn't. These aren't small errors. These are fundamental misunderstandings about how the world works, and they've led us into policy after policy that's failed to achieve its objectives. So what should we do differently? We need to start by acknowledging reality. The unipolar moment is over. American hegemony is declining, not because we're weak, but because the rest of the world is getting stronger, and that's actually a natural, even positive development. A world where billions of people are lifted out of poverty is a better world, even if it means we have relatively less power than we did when much of humanity was desperately poor. We need to redefine success in foreign policy. Success isn't maintaining dominance forever. Success is building a world where major powers can compete without devastating wars, where international institutions are strong enough to manage conflicts, where the existential threats we face together, climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, get the attention and resources they deserve. This requires a fundamentally different approach to countries like Mexico and Russia. With Mexico, we need a relationship based on genuine partnership, not patronizing dominance. That means addressing the drug problem as a shared responsibility, acknowledging that American demand drives the cartels. It means immigration reform that provides legal pathways and treats migrants with human dignity. It means economic policies that promote broadly shared prosperity rather than enriching elites on both sides of the border while leaving workers behind. It means respecting Mexican sovereignty even when they make choices we don't like. With Russia, we need to recognize that they're not going to collapse, and they're not going to fundamentally change their system because we want them to. That doesn't mean accepting everything they do. It means finding ways to coexist, to manage our disagreements without risking nuclear war, to cooperate where our interests align, even as we compete where they don't. This was the essence of détente during the Cold War, and it kept us from blowing up the world. We seem to have forgotten those lessons, and we need to remember them quickly. The broader lesson is about humility and realism in foreign policy. We need to stop treating every country's internal affairs as our business to manage. We need to stop assuming that we always know best. We need to stop using military force and economic coercion as our primary tools. We need to invest in diplomacy, in development, in building genuine partnerships based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. This isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's understanding that the world has changed and we need to change with it or become increasingly isolated and irrelevant. The choice we face isn't between American leadership and chaos. It's between adapting our approach to a multipolar world or clinging to a hegemonic fantasy that drives more and more countries away from us and toward alternatives like BRICS. Mexico and Russia are showing us the future if we don't change course. We should pay attention.